You never truly realize how fragile your life is until strangers show up in a moving truck to pack away 43 years of your memories. I was 66 years old, standing on the curb in my neighborhood, leaning heavily on my cane after a grueling knee replacement surgery. A young mover wiped sweat from his forehead, looked at me sympathetically, and asked if I was here to grab a few last personal items before they sealed the doors. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told him no, because they were already taking everything I had ever owned. My daughter, Sarah, stepped through the front door of the house my late husband, Arthur, and I had built with our own hands. She was holding a thick folder, looking mildly uncomfortable, but without a trace of genuine remorse. There was no warm hug, no tears, and no real explanation, just a cold, casual greeting as if we were bumping into each other at a supermarket. This was the front lawn where my daughter had learned to ride her bike, and where Arthur had tended his prized garden before cancer took him 7 years ago. I watched in absolute disbelief as two men hauled Arthur's handmade oak dining table into the back of the dark truck. Next came the antique vanity he had restored for our 20th anniversary, disappearing behind the heavy metal roll-up door. I turned to Sarah, my voice shaking as I asked her what on earth was happening to my life. She took a slow, deliberate breath and casually announced that she and her husband had sold the house. I let out a bitter laugh because the situation was so surreal, my brain simply refused to accept it. I reminded her that my name was on the deed, but Sarah just shrugged and mentioned the power of attorney I had signed right before my joint surgery. 6 weeks earlier, while I was preparing for the hospital, Sarah had brought over a mountain of legal paperwork, claiming it was just to handle my medical bills and insurance forms while I was in rehab. I trusted her implicitly because she was my only child, but now those very papers had been weaponized to strip away my entire existence. A woman holding a clipboard walked down the porch steps and informed Sarah that all the closing documents had been officially finalized. I looked toward the porch and saw the silver wind chime Arthur had bought me on our first trip to the coast, softly singing in the afternoon breeze. A second later, a mover unhooked it and tossed it unceremoniously into a cardboard box. Sarah's husband, Greg, walked out wearing expensive sunglasses, completely unbothered, complaining that they needed to hit the highway immediately if they wanted to reach their new city before nightfall. Greg handed me a plain white envelope, calling it a little something to help me get on my feet. Inside, I found a single folded $100 bill and a scrap of paper with 4 words written in Sarah's neat handwriting. "You will figure it out." I stared at the note, waiting for a punchline or a secondary page, but there was nothing else. When I asked if this was really all she was leaving me with, Greg stepped in and claimed they were giving me my total independence, assuming I would prefer finding my own path over being placed in an assisted living facility. I stood there in utter shock as Sarah explained they were relocating across the state so my grandson, Leo, could attend an elite private academy. When I asked where I was supposed to sleep that night, Greg casually suggested there were plenty of cheap motels along the highway that accepted cash. My sweet longtime neighbor, Clara, ran across the street with tears streaming down her face, wrapping her arms around me before glaring at my daughter and telling her she hoped Leo never treated her the same way in the future. Sarah looked away without saying a word, and within 20 minutes, every single physical footprint of my life had driven away down the street. Greg handed me a lightweight duffel bag containing a few changes of clothes and my prescription bottles, while every family album, keepsakes, and love letters Arthur had written me were gone forever. I declined Clara's generous offer to stay in her guest room because my soul desperately needed absolute silence, not pity. I climbed into my 15-year-old station wagon, turned the key, and drove away without looking back. I pulled into a dimly lit rest stop outside the city, reclined the driver's seat, and stared at the ceiling of my car. The interior smelled like old dust and cold coffee, but it was officially my new home. I pulled out Sarah's note one last time, looking at those 4 cruel words. Sitting alone in the dark with a broken body and a single $100 bill, I made a solemn promise that I would never ask my daughter for a single cent, and that one day she would realize exactly what she had discarded. The next morning, I woke up with an aching hip, a swollen knee, and a complete lack of direction. Brushing my teeth in a noisy public restroom while semi-trucks thundered past was a brutal reality check, but my deep sense of pride kept me moving forward. I stared at that $100 bill in my wallet and briefly thought about calling Sarah to ask why she had done this, but I knew no answer would change the cold reality of my situation. I started the engine and drove toward the heart of the city. I ended up at the small community church where Arthur and I used to volunteer decades ago, hoping to find a quiet corner to clear my head. Reverend David recognized me immediately, gasped when he saw me walking with a cane, and insisted I come into his office to rest. After listening quietly to my story for nearly an hour, he shook his head in disbelief and offered me the small vacant apartment located above the church's community center. The apartment was modest, but to me it felt like a sanctuary. I refused to live there for free, so I offered to spend my days repairing damaged woodwork, fixing jammed doors, and repainting the weathered furniture around the facility. Working with my hands brought back memories of watching Arthur in his workshop, and within a week, the rhythmic sound of sanding wood began to quiet the burning anger inside my chest. Fixing broken things reminded me that damage does not equal uselessness. Word quickly spread through the congregation about my knack for restoring old wooden furniture. An elderly parishioner brought me an antique rocking chair with a split frame, and when I successfully restored it, she insisted on paying me and telling her friends. Within a month, my tiny living room was packed with broken tables, cracked cabinets, and damaged heirlooms waiting for a second chance. A local retired contractor named Walter heard about my growing workload and offered me the use of his empty garage on the edge of town. He refused to charge me commercial rent, telling me to just fix up the neglected building and pay what I could once the business took off. We shook hands right there in the dusty driveway, proving to me that honor and human decency still existed in the world. Over the next few months, I poured every ounce of my remaining energy into turning that old garage into a legitimate restoration workshop. Orders began pouring in from antique collectors, local families, and interior designers who valued traditional craftsmanship. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something real out of the ashes of my old life, finding a deep sense of purpose in restoring the history and memories of others. Nearly 2 years after the day I was left on the curb, a luxury SUV pulled into the driveway of my workshop. Sarah stepped out, looking tired, stressed, and visibly shocked as she took in the thriving business bearing my name on the sign above the door. She walked inside, her voice trembling as she confessed that Greg's risky business ventures had failed, leaving them drowning in massive debt and facing the loss of their own home. She looked at me with eyes full of desperate expectation, clearly hoping I would use my newfound success to bail them out of their financial disaster. I looked at my daughter, feeling a deep sadness for the bond we had lost, but I felt no desire for revenge and no urge to compromise my self-respect. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a fresh envelope, and slid a single crisp $100 bill inside. I walked over, placed the envelope gently into Sarah's hand, and folded her fingers over it, just like she had done to me. I looked her dead in the eye and softly told her that she was strong, resourceful, and that I was giving her the total independence she once offered me. As she stood there in speechless silence, I turned back to my workbench, picked up my tools, and continued working on the life I had built with my own 2 hands.